Elena Chen always sat in the same spot every morning. Back row, third seat from the left, right next to the old radiator that made soft clicking sounds during winter months. She preferred it there because most people didn't notice her. In courtroom 4B, being invisible was exactly what she wanted. Every day at 8:30 sharp, Elena would slip through the heavy wooden doors carrying her worn leather bag and a simple notebook with a blue cover. She'd settle into her seat quietly, pull out her pen, and wait for the day to begin. To everyone else, she looked like just another court employee doing her job. Nothing special, nothing worth a second glance, but Elena saw everything. She watched how Judge Morrison's voice changed when certain lawyers walked into his courtroom. She noticed which cases got moved to earlier time slots and which ones got pushed back for weeks. She saw the small nods, the brief conversations during breaks, and the way some people seemed to know exactly what would happen before the judge even spoke. Elena worked as an assistant to Mrs. Peterson, the head court reporter. Her job was simple: organize files, make copies, and help keep track of case documents. It paid just enough to cover her tiny apartment rent and her mother's medical bills. Most days she barely spoke to anyone except Mrs. Peterson, and even then it was usually just "yes, ma'am," and "I'll get that ready for you." People thought Elena was just shy, and she was in a way, but there was so much more underneath that quiet surface that no one bothered to discover. 3 years ago, Elena had graduated from one of the best law schools in the country. She'd finished at the top of her class with honors that most lawyers could only dream about. Her professors had called her brilliant. Her classmates had been amazed by how quickly she could analyze complex legal problems and find solutions that others missed. But life had other plans for Elena, just as she was supposed to start. Her career at a big law firm. Her mother got sick, really sick. The kind of sick that requires constant doctor visits, expensive treatments, and someone to be there when things get scary. Elena's father had left when she was 12, so it was just the two of them. There wasn't really a choice to make. She turned down the law firm job that would have paid more money than she'd ever seen. Instead, she took the court assistant position because it had good health insurance and let her stay close to home. She told herself it was temporary, just until her mother got better, just until things settled down. That was 3 years ago. Now Elena spent her days in courtroom 4B, watching and listening and taking notes that no one ever asked to see. She told herself she was keeping her legal skills sharp by observing real cases. But deep down, she wondered if she was just hiding from the world she was supposed to be part of. Judge Morrison had been on the bench for 15 years. Everyone respected him. He had gray hair that was always perfectly combed and expensive suits that fit him just right. When he spoke, his voice carried authority that made people sit up straighter. He was known for being fair but tough, the kind of judge that lawyers either loved or feared depending on how well they'd prepared their cases. But Elena noticed things that others didn't, like how Judge Morrison's decisions seemed to follow certain patterns that had nothing to do with the law. She'd watched him give suspended sentences to people who clearly deserved jail time, while throwing the book at others for much smaller crimes. At first, she thought she was imagining it. Maybe she just didn't understand how the system really worked. But Elena had an unusual gift. She remembered everything. Every case, every decision, every detail. Her mind worked like a computer, storing information and making connections that others missed. And the connections she was seeing in Judge Morrison's courtroom didn't make sense legally. They made sense financially. Elena started keeping track in her blue notebook, not the official notes she took from Mrs. Peterson, but her own private observations. She wrote down names, dates, and case outcomes. She noted which lawyers seemed to have special access to the judge's chambers. She tracked which defendants lived in expensive neighborhoods and which ones came from the poor side of town. The patterns became clearer every day. Take last Tuesday's docket. Richard Webb, a contractor who'd been caught stealing money from the city, got probation and community service. His lawyer had played golf with Judge Morrison the weekend before. Elena had overheard them talking about their game. Meanwhile, Maria Santos, a single mother who'd written bad checks to buy groceries for her kids, got 6 months in jail. Her public defender had met her for the first time that morning. Elena wrote it all down. She also noticed the conversations that happened when court wasn't in session, how certain lawyers would linger after their cases were finished, chatting with the judge about weekend plans and vacation trips. how some case files seemed to disappear for a few hours before reappearing with different timestamps. How Judge Morrison's assistant would make phone calls and use words like "handle it" and "make sure." Elena's legal training told her exactly what she was seeing, but her shy personality kept her from doing anything about it. What if she was wrong? What if she misunderstood something? What if no one believed her? Besides, who was she to challenge a respected judge? She was just Elena Chen, the quiet girl who sat in the back and organized papers. She wasn't a real lawyer fighting cases or making important decisions. She was invisible, and maybe that's exactly where she belonged. But every day the notebook got fuller. Every day the patterns became more obvious. And every day Elena felt the weight of what she knew getting heavier on her shoulders. She would arrive at 8:30, take her seat by the radiator and watch justice get bought and sold right in front of her. She'd go home to her small apartment, check on her mother, and stare at the blue notebook on her kitchen table. Elena didn't know it yet, but Judge Morrison was starting to notice her too. He'd seen her taking notes during cases that didn't require note-taking. He'd watched her eyes follow conversations that weren't meant to be overheard, and he was beginning to wonder if the quiet girl in the back row might be seeing more than she should. The collision between Elena's careful observations and Judge Morrison's corrupt system was coming soon. And when it happened, everyone would discover that the most dangerous person in courtroom 4B wasn't the judge with all the power. It was the shy woman with the blue notebook who remembered everything. Elena thought Thursday morning would be like any other day. She arrived at her usual time, settled into her seat by the radiator, and opened her blue notebook to a fresh page. The courtroom was buzzing with more activity than usual because of the big case everyone had been talking about for weeks. Thomas Brennan was on trial for stealing $2 million from the city's construction fund. The money was supposed to fix roads and build a new community center, but somehow it had ended up in accounts that nobody could quite explain. Brennan owned the biggest construction company in town, and his family had been building things in the city for 3 generations. This wasn't just any case, it was the kind that made headlines and ended careers. Elena had been following the case closely, not just because it was interesting, but because something felt wrong about how it was being handled. The evidence seemed clear enough. Bank records, forged signatures, fake invoices, everything pointed to Brennan being guilty. But Judge Morrison's behavior during the hearings had been strange, even by his standards. That morning, Elena arrived early enough to see something she wasn't supposed to see. Judge Morrison was in his chambers with the door partially open. Elena could see him through the crack as she walked past carrying files for Mrs. Peterson. He was standing at his desk, holding what looked like documents from the Brennan case. But instead of reading them, he was doing something else entirely. Elena slowed her pace, pretending to struggle with the heavy box of files. From her angle, she could see Judge Morrison take a pen and make changes to one of the documents. Then he took out a different paper entirely and slipped it into the case folder where the original had been. Her heart started beating faster. Elena had studied evidence law extensively in school. What she was watching wasn't just wrong, it was a federal crime. Judges don't change evidence. Judges don't swap documents. Judges certainly don't tamper with case files when they think no one is looking. Elena forced herself to keep walking, but her hands were shaking as she delivered the files to Mrs. Peterson's office. She tried to focus on her normal tasks, but her mind kept replaying what she'd seen. Maybe she'd misunderstood. Maybe there was a legal explanation she didn't know about. But deep down, Elena knew exactly what she'd witnessed. An hour later, court was in session, and Elena was back in her usual seat with her notebook. The prosecution was presenting their financial evidence against Brennan. Elena watched as the prosecutor held up documents that supposedly proved Brennan had forged the mayor's signature. On several contracts, Elena had seen those same documents during her work with Mrs. Peterson. She remembered them clearly, because she had an eye for details that others missed. The documents being presented in court weren't the same ones that had been filed originally. The signatures looked different. The dates had been changed. Someone had swapped the evidence with versions that were much less convincing. Elena's pen moved quickly across her notebook page. She wrote down everything she remembered about the original documents and compared them to what was being shown in court. The differences were subtle but significant. Someone with her memory and legal training could spot them. but the average person wouldn't notice. Judge Morrison was helping Thomas Brennan get away with stealing $2 million from the city. Elena felt sick to her stomach. All those notes she'd been taking, all those patterns she'd been seeing, this was so much worse than she'd imagined. Judge Morrison wasn't just showing favoritism to certain lawyers or giving lighter sentences to wealthy defendants. He was actively participating in crimes. As the morning progressed, Elena noticed something else troubling. Judge Morrison kept glancing in her direction. At first, she thought she was imagining it. Why would he be looking at her? She was just part of the background, invisible as always. But it wasn't her imagination. During a break in the proceedings, Elena saw Judge Morrison lean over and whisper something to his assistant, Mrs. Williams. Both of them looked toward the back of the courtroom where Elena was sitting. Mrs. Williams nodded and wrote something down on a small piece of paper. Elena's training kicked in. In law school, they taught her to trust her instincts when something felt dangerous. Right now, every instinct she had was screaming that she was in trouble. She thought about the evidence tampering she'd witnessed. She thought about all the notes in her blue notebook documenting months of suspicious behavior. She thought about how carefully she'd been watching and listening to things that weren't meant for her eyes and ears, Judge. Morrison had noticed her noticing. Elena tried to stay calm. Through the rest of the morning session, she took her normal notes and acted like everything was fine. But when lunch break came, instead of staying in the building like usual, she walked to the small park across the street and called her mother. "Mom, I think I might be in some trouble at work," Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What kind of trouble, sweetheart?" her mother asked. "You're the most careful person I know." Elena couldn't explain the whole situation over the phone. How could she tell her sick mother that she'd accidentally discovered a judge was corrupt, and that same judge might now see her as a threat? Instead, she just said, "I might need to look for a new job soon. I'll explain everything when I get home." When Elena returned from lunch, Mrs. Williams was waiting by her usual seat. "Elena, Judge Morrison would like to see you in his chambers," Mrs. Williams said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Elena's blood turned cold. In 3 years of working in the courthouse, she'd never been called to see Judge Morrison privately. Court employees at her level didn't have meetings with judges. They especially didn't have meetings with judges who just caught them witnessing evidence tampering. "Did he say what it was about?" Elena asked, hoping her voice sounded normal. "Oh, just some questions about case file organization," Mrs. Williams replied. "Nothing to worry about." Elena followed Mrs. Williams down the hallway, her mind racing. Every step felt like walking toward the edge of a cliff. She thought about running. She thought about calling the FBI right then and there. She thought about all the people Thomas Brennan had stolen money from, and all the people who would suffer if he got away with it. But Elena was still the same shy person she'd always been. The person who avoided confrontation and tried not to make waves. Even knowing what she knew, even seeing what she'd seen, she couldn't bring herself to cause a scene. Judge Morrison's chambers were bigger than Elena had expected. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, and law books filled shelves from floor to ceiling. The judge sat behind a massive desk that made him look even more intimidating than usual. "Elena, please sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "I've been watching your work lately, and I'm impressed by how observant you are." The way he said observant made Elena's skin crawl. It wasn't a compliment. "Thank you, Your Honor," Elena managed to say. "Mrs. Peterson tells me you have an excellent memory for details, that you notice things others might miss." Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Elena's face. "That's a valuable skill in this business, but it can also be dangerous if not used properly." Elena's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "I just try to do my job well, sir." "I'm sure you do," Judge Morrison said. "But sometimes people see things that they think they understand, when really they don't have the full picture. Sometimes people make assumptions that could get them into serious trouble." He was threatening her, not directly, but clearly enough that there was no mistaking his meaning. "I understand, Your Honor," Elena said quietly. "I hope you do," Judge Morrison replied, "because I'd hate for anything unfortunate to happen to such a dedicated employee, especially one with a sick mother who depends on good health insurance." Elena's blood ran cold. He knew about her mother. He'd done research on her. This wasn't just a warning. It was a promise that he could destroy her life if she became a problem. "You can go back to work now," Judge Morrison said with a smile that looked like a shark showing its teeth. Elena stood up on shaking legs and walked out of his chambers. She made it back to her seat in the courtroom, but she couldn't focus on anything happening around her. All she could think about was the look in Judge Morrison's eyes and the way he'd mentioned her mother. She was in real danger now. But Elena didn't know that Judge Morrison had already decided she knew too much to live quietly with her observations. Before the week was over, she would find herself facing criminal charges that could send her to prison. The trap was already being set. Elena couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Judge Morrison's cold smile and heard his words about her mother. She kept replaying the meeting in her head, wondering if she'd imagined the threat or if it was as real as it felt. By morning, she'd made a decision. She would keep her head down, do her job quietly, and stay out of Judge Morrison's way. Maybe if she was invisible enough, he'd forget about her entirely. Maybe the whole thing would just blow over. Elena was wrong about that. When she arrived at the courthouse Friday morning, everything seemed normal at first. Mrs. Peterson greeted her with the usual stack of files to organize. Elena settled into her routine, grateful for the familiar tasks that helped calm her nerves. She even managed to convince herself that yesterday's meeting might not have been as threatening as she'd thought. That illusion lasted exactly 3 hours. Elena was in the file room, organizing case documents for the following week's trials. The room was small and cramped, with metal filing cabinets lining every wall. She'd been working alone for about an hour when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. "I need to check something in the file room," a voice said. Elena recognized it immediately. Judge Morrison's assistant, Mrs. Williams. Elena froze. There was nowhere to hide in the tiny room and only one way out. She quickly grabbed a stack of files and pretended to be busy organizing them, hoping Mrs. Williams would just grab whatever she needed and leave. But Mrs. Williams didn't seem to be looking for anything specific. She walked around the room slowly, opening and closing filing cabinet drawers like she was searching for something. After a few minutes, she stopped at Elena's workstation. "Oh, Elena, I didn't see you there," Mrs. Williams said, though her tone suggested she'd known exactly where Elena was the whole time. "Just organizing the Monday files," Elena replied, not looking up from her work. Mrs. Williams nodded and continued her strange search. She opened Elena's desk drawer, looked inside, then closed it again. She checked behind some of the file cabinets and even looked under Elena's chair. The whole thing felt like theater, like Mrs. Williams was putting on a show for an audience Elena couldn't see. Finally, Mrs. Williams left. Elena waited a full 5 minutes before moving, just to make sure she was really gone. Something about the whole interaction felt wrong, but Elena couldn't put her finger on what exactly had bothered her. She found out 2 hours later. Elena was back at her usual seat in the courtroom when courthouse security officers walked in. There were 3 of them, and they looked serious. Elena watched them approach Mrs. Peterson's desk and have a quiet conversation with her. Mrs. Peterson's face went white. Then all 4 of them turned to look directly at Elena. "Elena Chen?" one of the security officers called out. Elena's heart sank. "Yes? We need you to come with us, please." The walk to the security office felt like the longest walk of Elena's life. Every person they passed in the hallway stared at her. She could hear whispers following behind them. By the time they reached the small security office, Elena's hands were shaking. "Elena, we received a report that confidential case documents are missing," the head security officer, Mr. Rodriguez, explained. "We need to search your workspace and belongings." "Missing documents?" Elena asked. "I don't understand." "Someone saw you in the file room earlier today acting suspiciously," Mr. Rodriguez continued. "They reported that you seemed to be hiding something." Elena thought about Mrs. Williams and her strange behavior in the file room. The pieces started falling into place, but it was too late to do anything about it. The search was thorough and humiliating. They went through Elena's desk, her bag, even her coat pockets. Elena stood there helplessly as they pulled out every personal item she owned. Ned examined it closely. Then Mr. Rodriguez opened the bottom drawer of Elena's desk, a drawer she rarely used because it stuck and was hard to open. Inside, underneath some old office supplies, were 3 manila folders containing confidential case documents. Elena stared at the folders in shock. She'd never seen them before in her life. Elena, These are highly confidential documents from active cases, Mr. Rodriguez said, holding up the folders. Taking these home is a federal crime. I didn't take them, Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. I've never seen those before. Someone must have put them there. But even as she said it, Elena knew how it sounded. Every criminal claimed they were innocent. Every person caught with stolen goods said someone else had planted the evidence. Elena, I have to place you under arrest, Mr. Rodriguez said sadly. He'd always been kind to her, and Elena could see that he didn't want to believe she was guilty. But the evidence was right there in black and white. The next few hours passed in a blur. Elena was handcuffed and led out of the courthouse in front of everyone she worked with. She saw Mrs. Peterson watching from her office window, looking shocked and disappointed. She saw other court employees gathered in small groups, whispering and pointing. Elena had gone from invisible to infamous in a single afternoon. At the police station, Elena was fingerprinted, photographed, and put in a holding cell. She was allowed one phone call, which she used to call her mother. "Mom, I'm in jail," Elena said, trying not to cry. "I've been arrested for stealing from work." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that Elena thought the call had been disconnected. "Elena, what happened?" Her mother finally asked. "You're the most honest person I know." "I don't know, Mom. Someone planted evidence in my desk. I'm being framed." Even saying the words out loud sounded crazy to Elena. "Honey, I don't have money for a lawyer," her mother said quietly. "My medical bills—" "I know, Mom. They'll assign me someone. Don't worry about me. Just focus on getting better." But Elena was worried. She was terrified. The next morning, Elena was released on bail and assigned a public defender named David Park. He looked like he'd just graduated from law school the week before, and he seemed more nervous about the case than Elena was. "The evidence against you is pretty strong," David admitted during their first meeting. "Confidential documents were found in your desk, and there's a witness who saw you acting suspiciously in the file room." "The witness was Judge Morrison's assistant," Elena said. "She's the one who planted the evidence." David looked uncomfortable. "Elena, I understand you're scared, but making accusations against a judge's staff isn't going to help your case. Judge Morrison is one of the most respected judges in the state." Elena realized that David wasn't going to believe her, let alone fight for her. He was already planning to plead her case down to a lesser charge and hope for the best. "When is my trial?" Elena asked. "You're lucky," David said. "Judge Morrison agreed to hear your case personally. He wants to move it through quickly so you can put this behind you." Elena's blood ran cold. Judge Morrison was going to be the judge at her own trial. The man who had framed her would be the one deciding her fate. That night, Elena sat in her tiny apartment with her blue notebook spread out on the kitchen table. Her mother was sleeping in the next room, exhausted from another round of chemotherapy. Elena looked at all the notes she'd taken over the past months, all the evidence of Judge Morrison's corruption that no one would ever believe. For the first time since her arrest, Elena felt something other than fear. She felt angry. Judge Morrison thought he was smart, using his power to destroy a shy girl who'd seen too much. He thought Elena would quietly accept whatever punishment he decided to give her. He thought she was just another victim who would disappear without a fight. Judge Morrison had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated exactly who he was dealing with. Elena opened her notebook to a fresh page and started writing. Not observations this time, but plans. She might be shy and she might be scared. But she was also a legal genius who remembered everything, and she was about to remind Judge Morrison that the most dangerous person in any courtroom isn't always the one sitting behind the judge's bench. Elena had spent 3 years being invisible. But invisible people see everything, remember everything, and when pushed too far, they can become the most dangerous opponents of all. Judge Morrison was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Elena's trial was set for the following Tuesday. She spent the weekend preparing in a way that would have surprised anyone who knew her. The shy, quiet court assistant was gone. In her place sat a woman with a sharp mind and 3 years of careful observations. Elena spread everything out on her kitchen table. Her blue notebook filled with months of detailed observations, copies of court documents she'd legally obtained through her work, photos she'd taken with her phone of suspicious meetings and conversations, financial records she'd found in public databases, security footage timestamps she'd carefully noted. For 3 years, Elena had been invisible in that courtroom. But invisible people have one huge advantage. They see everything and no one pays attention to what they're collecting. Monday morning, Elena walked into the courthouse feeling different than she had in years. She wore her best suit, the one she'd bought for law school interviews but never had a chance to wear in court. She carried herself straighter, spoke clearer, and for the first time in a long time, she looked people directly in the eye. David Park was waiting for her outside the courtroom, looking nervous as usual. "Elena, I've been thinking about your case all weekend," he said. "I think I can get you a plea deal. Maybe 2 years probation instead of jail time." "I'm not taking a plea deal," Elena said calmly. David looked confused. "Elena, the evidence against you is really strong. The prosecution has witnesses, they have the documents that were found in your desk. Fighting this could mean 5 years in prison." "I'm not taking a plea deal because I'm not guilty," Elena said, "and I'm going to prove it." "Look, I understand you're scared, but we need to be realistic here." "David," Elena interrupted, "I need to tell you something. I'm firing you." David's mouth fell open. "You're what?" "I'm going to represent myself." "Elena, that's crazy. You can't represent yourself in a criminal trial. You're not a lawyer." Elena smiled for the first time in weeks. "Actually, I am." Before David could respond, Elena walked into the courtroom. She could feel every eye in the room following her as she made her way to the defendant's table. Judge Morrison was already seated behind his bench, and when he saw Elena, his confident smile faltered just slightly. "Your Honor," Elena said, standing up before anyone could stop her. "I'd like to make a motion." The prosecutor, Amanda Foster, looked annoyed. "Your Honor, the defendant's attorney should be making any motions." "I am the defendant's attorney," Elena said clearly. "I'm representing myself." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Morrison banged his gavel, but Elena could see uncertainty in his eyes for the first time. "Miss Chen," Judge Morrison said slowly, "representing yourself in a criminal trial is not advisable. You don't have legal training." Elena reached into her briefcase and pulled out a document. "Your Honor, I graduated from Harvard Law School 3 years ago, summa cum laude. I passed the state bar exam with the highest score in my class. I'm a licensed attorney in this state." The whispers got louder. Elena heard someone in the back row say, "She's been working as a court assistant this whole time?" Judge Morrison's face had gone pale. "Miss Chen, why haven't you been practicing law?" "Personal reasons, Your Honor," Elena said. "But I assure you I am fully qualified to represent myself in this matter." Amanda Foster stood up. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We weren't informed that the defendant was an attorney." "The prosecution had access to the same public records I'm referencing," Elena said smoothly. "My bar certification is a matter of public record. The fact that you didn't research my background isn't my problem." Elena was already winning, and she'd only been speaking for 2 minutes. Judge Morrison tried to regain control. "Very well. Miss Chen, you may represent yourself. Let's proceed with the opening statements." But Elena wasn't finished. "Your Honor, before we begin, I have several preliminary motions to make." "What kind of motions?" Judge Morrison asked, and Elena could hear the warning in his voice. "First, I'm motioning to exclude the evidence found in my desk on the grounds that it was planted by someone with access to the courthouse file room." "That's a serious accusation," Amanda Foster said. "Do you have any proof?" Elena smiled. "I have security footage, witness statements, and physical evidence that will prove not only that the documents were planted, but who planted them and why." The courtroom was completely silent now. Elena could see people leaning forward in their seats. "Second," Elena continued, "I'm motioning for a change of venue on the grounds that this court has a conflict of interest." Judge Morrison's voice was ice cold. "What conflict of interest?" "The conflict that arises when the presiding judge is the primary subject of the criminal investigation that led to my arrest." Every person in the courtroom gasped. Elena heard Mrs. Peterson whisper, "Oh my God," from somewhere behind her. Judge Morrison's face turned red. "Miss Chen, that's a completely inappropriate and unfounded accusation. Is it?" Elena asked. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Because I have documented evidence of judicial misconduct spanning the last 14 months. Evidence tampering, bribery, case fixing, and conspiracy to obstruct justice." Amanda Foster looked like she'd been hit by a truck. "Your Honor, I had no knowledge of any of these accusations." Because the corruption goes higher than just Judge Morrison, Elena said. It involves city contractors, defense attorneys, and court staff. People have been stealing millions of dollars from this city, while Judge Morrison made sure they never faced real consequences. Elena opened her folder and pulled out the first document. On March 15th of last year, Judge Morrison altered evidence in People v. Thomas Brennan. I witnessed him swapping financial documents in his chambers before court began. The original documents clearly showed forged signatures. The documents presented in court had been modified to make the forgeries less obvious. That's impossible, Judge Morrison said, but his voice was shaking. Is it? Elena asked. She held up a photograph. This is a picture of the original document taken during routine filing procedures. This, she held up another photo, is the same document as presented in court. Notice the different date stamps and signature patterns. Elena's voice grew stronger with each word. She'd spent years being quiet and invisible. But now that she was speaking, 3 years of legal training and natural intelligence came flooding out. Furthermore, Elena continued, I have records of 23 cases where Judge Morrison's sentencing patterns show clear bias based on the defendant's financial status and personal connections to the judge. I have documented phone calls between the judge's chambers and the offices of preferred defense attorneys. I have financial records showing suspicious cash deposits into accounts linked to Judge Morrison's family members. The courtroom was in chaos now. People were taking pictures with their phones. Court reporters were writing furiously. Elena could see several people in the gallery making phone calls, probably to news stations. Judge Morrison banged his gavel repeatedly. This court is in recess. Your Honor, Elena said loudly, I haven't finished presenting my evidence. Miss Chen, you are out of order. No, Your Honor, Elena said, her voice carrying across the courtroom with an authority that surprised even her. You are out of order. You have been out of order for months, and I have the evidence to prove it. Elena turned to face the crowded courtroom. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of being seen. She wasn't trying to be invisible. Ladies and gentlemen, Elena said, for 3 years I've been sitting in the back of this courtroom watching justice be bought and sold. I've seen guilty people walk free because they had money and connections. I've seen innocent people go to prison because they couldn't afford proper representation. I've watched Judge Morrison turn this courtroom into his personal marketplace. Judge Morrison was shouting for order, but no one was listening to him anymore. Everyone in the room was focused on Elena. I was arrested because I saw too much and knew too much, Elena continued. Judge Morrison thought he could frame a shy court assistant and make her disappear quietly. He made one mistake. He assumed I was powerless. Elena held up her blue notebook. Every conversation, every suspicious ruling, every piece of evidence that went missing. I wrote it all down. I remembered everything. And now I'm going to make sure everyone else knows what's been happening in this courtroom. The transformation was complete. Elena Chen, the invisible court assistant, was gone. In her place stood Elena Chen, the legal genius who was about to bring down one of the most corrupt judges in the state. Judge Morrison's empire was crumbling, and Elena was just getting started. The courtroom was in complete chaos. Judge Morrison kept banging his gavel and shouting for order, but nobody was listening to him anymore. Everyone was focused on Elena and the evidence she was presenting. Phone cameras were recording everything, and Elena could hear people in the hallway outside trying to get into the packed courtroom. Your Honor, Elena said, her voice cutting through the noise. I have one more piece of evidence to present. Judge Morrison looked desperate now. Miss Chen, this court is in recess. You need to stop talking immediately. Actually, Your Honor, you don't have the authority to call a recess right now, Elena said calmly. According to State Judicial Procedure Code Section 247B, once a defendant has begun presenting evidence of judicial misconduct, the court must allow the presentation to continue until completion. Amanda Foster, the prosecutor, stood up looking confused and overwhelmed. Your Honor, I don't know what's happening here, but I think we need to... Elena interrupted her. Ms. Foster, 3 months ago I contacted the FBI about the corruption I'd been observing in this courtroom. I've been working with Special Agent Rebecca Torres ever since. As if on cue, the courtroom doors opened and 3 people in dark suits walked in. The lead agent, a woman with short brown hair, approached the bench. Your Honor, I'm Special Agent Torres with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest. The courtroom erupted again. Judge Morrison's face went completely white. This is outrageous. You can't arrest me in my own courtroom. Actually, we can, Agent Torres said firmly. Judge Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. Elena watched as the judge who had threatened her just days ago was handcuffed and read his rights. She felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She'd never wanted things to go this far, but Judge Morrison had forced her hand when he tried to frame her. Miss Chen, Agent Torres said, turning to Elena, thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. Your evidence and testimony have been invaluable. What happens to my case now? Elena asked. What case? Agent Torres smiled. The charges against you are being dropped immediately. The evidence was clearly planted, and you've proven that beyond any doubt. Elena felt like she could breathe for the first time in weeks. The weight she'd been carrying since her arrest was finally lifting from her shoulders. Amanda Foster approached Elena's table, looking embarrassed. Miss Chen, I owe you an apology. I had no idea about any of this corruption. I was just prosecuting based on the evidence that was presented to me. I understand, Elena said. You were being manipulated just like everyone else. As Judge Morrison was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Elena noticed Mrs. Williams trying to slip out quietly through a side door, but Agent Torres had noticed her too. Mrs. Williams, we'd like to speak with you as well, Agent Torres called out. We have some questions about your role in planting evidence. Mrs. Williams stopped in her tracks, her face pale. It turned out that Elena's careful observations had implicated more people than just Judge Morrison. Over the next few hours, the scope of the corruption became clear. Elena's evidence had uncovered a network that included Judge Morrison, his assistant Mrs. Williams, 3 defense attorneys, 2 city contractors, and even a city council member. They'd been working together for over 2 years, fixing cases and stealing money from city contracts. The story spread quickly beyond the courthouse. By evening, news trucks were parked outside, and Elena's story was being reported on television stations across the state. The shy court assistant who had brought down a corrupt judge became an overnight sensation. But Elena wasn't interested in the media attention. She had more important things to focus on. The next morning, Elena was back in the courthouse, but this time she was there as an attorney, not a defendant. Agent Torres had asked her to help review all of Judge Morrison's cases from the past 2 years, to identify which ones had been affected by corruption. Elena, Agent Torres said as they sat in a conference room surrounded by boxes of case files, we're going to need to review over 300 cases. Some of these people were wrongly convicted because of Judge Morrison's actions. Elena looked at the mountain of files and felt overwhelmed for a moment. Then she remembered all the innocent people she'd watched get unfair sentences while guilty people walked free. Her resolve strengthened. Where do we start? Elena asked. The work was exhausting but important. Elena's perfect memory and legal training made her invaluable to the investigation. She could remember details about cases from months ago, spotting patterns and inconsistencies that others missed. Within a week, they'd identified 47 cases where Judge Morrison's corruption had affected the outcome. Innocent people would be released from prison. Guilty people who'd escaped justice would face new trials. Victims who'd been denied justice would finally get their day in court. Elena worked 18-hour days for 2 weeks straight, but she didn't mind. For the first time since law school, she felt like she was using her talents for something that truly mattered. Thomas Brennan, the contractor who'd stolen $2 million from the city, was arrested at his home. The evidence Elena had preserved proved his guilt beyond any doubt. The money would be recovered and used for the community projects it was originally intended for. Elena also helped identify dozens of other victims of the corruption. People who'd lost their homes, their businesses, their freedom because Judge Morrison had been selling justice to the highest bidder. 3 weeks after Judge Morrison's arrest, Elena received a call that changed her life. Miss Chen, this is John. Athen Blake from the State Attorney General's office, the voice on the phone said. We'd like to offer you a position as a special prosecutor focusing on judicial corruption cases. Elena was quiet for a long moment. I'm honored by the offer, but I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that. Miss Chen, you just brought down one of the biggest corruption cases in state history, using nothing but careful observation and legal knowledge. I think you're more ready than you realize. Elena thought about her mother, who was getting better now that her treatments were working. She thought about all the people who'd been hurt by corruption in the justice system. She thought about the 3 years she'd spent being invisible and afraid to use her talents. "Can I start next month?" Elena asked. Absolutely. Elena's first case as a special prosecutor was reviewing judicial misconduct allegations in 3 other counties. Her methods were unique. Instead of relying only on formal complaints, she spent time observing courtrooms and talking to court staff. She knew that the people who saw everything were often the ones nobody paid attention to. Within 6 months, Elena had helped uncover corruption in 2 more courts, leading to the resignation of another judge and the conviction of several attorneys who'd been bribing court officials. Elena's story became legendary in legal circles. Law schools invited her to speak about ethics and corruption. Young lawyers sought her advice about standing up for justice even when it was difficult or dangerous. But Elena's favorite part of her new career was the letters she received from people whose cases had been reviewed because of her work. Letters from people who'd been released from prison after wrongful convictions. Letters from families who'd received compensation for losses caused by corrupt officials. Letters from victims who'd finally received justice. One letter in particular meant the world to Elena. It was from a young woman named Lisa, who'd been wrongly convicted of theft and had spent 8 months in prison because of Judge Morrison's corruption. "Dear Elena," the letter said, "I don't know if you remember my case, but you helped get my conviction overturned. I want you to know that you gave me my life back. I'm back in school now studying to become a paralegal. I want to help people the way you helped me. Thank you for being brave enough to speak up when it mattered." Elena kept that letter in her desk drawer and read it whenever she had a difficult day. Elena also made sure to visit her mother every week, bringing her updates about her cases and her new life. Her mother was proud of her daughter's transformation from shy observer to fearless advocate for justice. "I always knew you were special," her mother told her during one visit. "I just didn't know how special until you decided to let the world see it too." Elena smiled. "I learned something important, Mom. Being invisible isn't always about being powerless. Sometimes the most invisible people have the most power of all, because they see everything. And when they finally decide to speak up, nobody can ignore them." Judge Morrison was eventually sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Mrs. Williams received 5 years. The other conspirators received various sentences based on their level of involvement. Elena continued working as a special prosecutor, building a reputation as someone who couldn't be intimidated or corrupted. She never forgot the lessons she'd learned from her time in the back row of courtroom 4B. That justice requires constant vigilance, that corruption thrives in shadows, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply paying attention and refusing to stay silent. Elena Chen had started as an invisible observer in a corrupt courtroom. She'd ended up as one of the most respected prosecutors in the state, known for her integrity, her intelligence, and her unwavering commitment to justice. Most importantly, she'd learned that being shy didn't mean being powerless. Sometimes the quietest people see the most clearly, remember the most accurately, and when they finally find their voice, they can change everything.